Thanks everyone for joining my session on Sitecore Identity. A new way of authentication mechanism. So my name is Himadri. I am a Sitecore MVP for last 5 years or so. And I come from a place called Cincinnati. I work in Nishtec Inc. We're a Sitecore partner. I am there. I am a solution architect. So before I start, a little bit of background, how I get into this Sitecore Identity. So I went to symposium, and then I watched couple of sessions on Sitecore host and Sitecore Identity. I have done some security related work, and then I thought that I should choose something that I want to learn, and Sitecore host and Sitecore Identity is a new thing, and Sitecore is going towards service-based architecture, and Sitecore host is the future. Fortunately, for Sitecore MVPs, we get the tech preview. So I started looking into that and ended up writing a blog of 4,000 words. And I have 3 blogs now, and a lot of people liked it. I really appreciate there are a lot of good words about it. And I thought that, okay, so I'll make a presentation, and I set my presentation here, and it was accepted. Now I am here talking about it, and everything here is based on that blog. So within 40 minutes span, it's really difficult to cover everything. So I will at the end have the link for my blog. Okay, so obviously we are going to talk about Sitecore Identity, or what it is actually. But then I was practicing this speech with my colleagues, and then I realized that I might talk too much and may not have much time to actually show the demo. So I decided to shuffle the demo first. There are a couple of 3 demos, and I'll show a couple of them first, and then we talk about Sitecore Identity, why Sitecore Identity is needed with the current architecture where Sitecore is going. We'll talk about Sitecore Identity flow, how identity works, and then finally we'll have a Sitecore client, identity client demo. So what is Sitecore Identity? It's an identity provider. You can think of it is a service. The whole purpose of the service is actually outsource all security related work to a separate service. So by doing that, when you have a service-based architecture and you want to authorize, or you want to protect your resources, services, you actually do that using a separate identity provider. So it is based on Sitecore host application. If you have seen Stephen Pope's presentation yesterday, he talked about Sitecore host, and since it is Sitecore host-based application, it comes with all the good things in Sitecore. Right now, there are Sitecore Identity publishing service and the Sitecore universal tracker are based on, there are 3 Sitecore host-based applications. So it has all the good thing about runtime plugin loading, diagnostic and dependency injection, all you can get out of it. It was built based on the Sitecore. It was built based on Identity Server 4 framework. If you have not seen Identity Server 4, this is actually a framework which was created to create .NET Core based identity provider. It doesn't tell you like how you want to do your authentication, but the good thing about using Identity Server 4 is that you don't have to think too much about the underneath protocol like OAuth 2 or for example OpenID Connect. So everything comes with it. So it's very easy to create a identity provider. So that's what it is used. Implements security based on OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect. We'll talk a little bit about that. We cannot go too much detail because it's a huge topic. Then authentication is still using the membership provider. So Sitecore Identity is actually a separate service, but as far as the authentication goes, it still uses the old ASP.NET membership provider. It supports federated authentication through sub-provider. So federated authentication was there in the earlier version of Sitecore 9, but it is much easier to work with now because the identity provider supports the sub-provider. So we will see some demo of that in the next. And it is an optional service. It's completely optional. So you can actually turn it off and you can go back to old way of Sitecore, logging into Sitecore. So not necessarily that you have to use it, but that's the direction Sitecore is going. So I mean, it's good to know about it. Can you switch to demo? So I should have shown the other slide, but the first demo is actually using the Azure AD sub-provider. Is there anyone here that have not seen Sitecore 9.1? And I don't think so. So you probably have seen Identity Server. So when you go to Identity Server, when you go to new Sitecore, so you will see that you will be immediately redirect to the Identity Server site, and where you go and you can enter your username, password, and you can authenticate to Sitecore using the identity provider. In this case, Sitecore Identity Provider is the identity provider which is authenticating you. But it is possible to add other sub-provider. Identity provider comes with the Azure AD sub-provider, so you can activate that, or you can actually write your own identity provider sub-provider, and you can use that to authenticate too. So for using Azure Identity Provider, we need to have a Azure account first of all. So I have created an Azure account, which is, I'm going to show you. So it is going to use the Azure Active Directory. The first thing we need to do is actually register our application. And you go to the app registration. Here I have created my Sitecore 910 app. This is the one that actually I'm going to use for my sub-provider authentication. And few things to see here is that this client ID is the one that will be used when Sitecore Identity Provider will talk to this sub-provider. So you need to take that and tenant ID is actually the identity provider, means which application I am going to connecting to, which is like the application that I registered. So you can have multiple applications, so they will have a different directory and different tenant ID. You need these two, and then as far as the authentication goes, where this authentication coming from, this is your Sitecore Identity Server sign-in OIDC, which is OpenID Connect authentication login. And there are like, if you go to manifest, you have to actually provide where the redirect URL will be. For example, in this case, once the authentication is done, I want to go back with the, with my sign-in URL, which is go to my, Sitecore link, go back there. One most important thing here is that, which took me some time to actually understand what is going on. You have an account in Azure. That does not mean that you can log into Sitecore. You have to actually map your account to Sitecore in a way that Sitecore understands this is something coming from outside, so it will let you in Sitecore. So the way it does in identity provider is actually the group membership claims, and then there is a claim transformation happens, which I'm going to show you in the config in a little bit. But if you don't have that, you will not be able to log into Sitecore. It will actually authenticate you, but then it will throw some error. So you have to set group membership claims to security group. And security group means in my Azure directory, I have groups, and this is the group I created, and I am the only user there now. So when I am doing the transformation, claim transformation, I need to say this object ID is coming from outside. I want to transform this as an admin account so that it can log into Sitecore. So this is something I was dealing with, and then a gentleman, his name is Derek, I'm glad that he wrote that blog, and then I came to understand that what is happening, and I could solve that problem by reading his blog. So that is the Azure side of thing. Now I should sign out from here, otherwise it will take me to the okay. So as far as the configuration goes, as I was talking to you about first of all, you need to enable the provider. Okay. The authentication schema is what you use to identify this sub-provider, and wherever you go and you want to use this sub-provider, you need to use this authentication schema. We talked about client ID, we talked about tenant ID, and what we talked about is Azure AD user, admin user, the claim transformation, where I was talking about a group with object ID this will be transformed to a claim which is admin. So that means that if someone is logging from that group, he will be able to log in Sitecore. So let's save it, and I will recycle, because this actually loads in the application load, so I need to recycle the app pool. Once I do that, if I refresh my Sitecore login, I should see a button here that takes me to the Azure login. Okay, so now you can see I have an option to log in using my Azure account. What happens if I click here? It takes me to Azure instead of like I am typing my Sitecore user. I log in with my account. So it's actually returning to, after authentication, it's returning to Sitecore Identity Server URL, and it should let me in to Sitecore. Okay, so now I can log into Sitecore from there. All right. So that was the Azure demo, and if I log out, it takes me back to Sitecore screen again. So next demo that I'm going to show is a custom, custom sub-provider. So you can create a custom sub-provider which is a Sitecore host runtime plugin. As you know that in Sitecore host, you really can have two kinds of plugin that one that is compile plugin, and you can have runtime plugin. So Sitecore Identity comes with Sitecore the Azure AD plugin, so it is a compile plugin. But if you write your own plugin, that will be a runtime plugin. So a little bit about that is if I go to Sitecore Identity Server root directory, so all compile plugin that comes from Sitecore is in the Sitecore directory, and you can see that Azure plugin, Azure provider, identity provider plugin is here, and the config file that I was showing you, I was changing this. Now when I wrote my own custom plugin, that plugin needs to go to the runtime folder, then you have the environment, and under the environment you put your plugin DLL, and then your config file goes to config directory. So this is the config file that has my custom provider. So the custom provider that I wrote uses the identity server I have to actually copy the. So if you have worked on identity server, you know that they have a lot of samples, and they do have a provider available to test code. So this is their provider which is available in internet. You can connect to it, and they support all possible OAuth grant. So the one that I chose is implicit grant type. Implicit grant type is used mostly for the browser-based application. The client ID is implicit. This is the provider that I'm going to use for my custom provider. So this is my client ID. I will turn it on or enable it. And one other thing, I will talk about it a little bit later, but I need to actually turn this disable this because the Azure provider, I need to disable Azure provider because there is a bug. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So I just turned on my custom provider here, and let me recycle the app pool. So now I have my own custom provider showing up here, and code wise, really I'm going to show you the demo, but it's a runtime plugin, a Sitecore host runtime plugin, and there are two things that are really like you need to do is actually configure your service, which is add the OpenID Connect service to your plugin, and you mentioned that my sign-in schema will be an external identity server provider. So it is not my custom provider, is actually an external identity server provider of Sitecore Identity provider. So it's going out of Sitecore Identity provider. Client ID, I was showing you, this is coming from that that configuration. The client ID is implicit, which is the same name and registered in identity server identity provider, and the authority URL is demo.identityserver.io, which I just showed you. So once this runtime plugin is loaded, it goes through this and it identifies the identity provider using the authentication schema name, and it loads that in the Sitecore Identity provider. So if I go here and now try to log in, it should take me to that identity provider, demo identity server for a provider, which is a very simple implementation. And if I log in, it should take me back to Sitecore. Now the thing is that I do not have any claim transformation here. So Sitecore does not know I am coming from outside, but there is no connection between my user in the identity server demo identity provider and Sitecore. So since there is no connection there, it is not able to let me in the in Sitecore because I am not recognized as an admin. So that's what is actually showing me this message. So as so that's the two demo I wanted to show you about the sub provider. It is also possible to actually completely skip this identity server screen. You can actually go to the federated authentication config in Sitecore, and you can add your sub provider, like the sub provider name with the authentication schema. So it will actually completely skip the identity provider screen, and it will take you to the Azure provider directly. Can you please switch to the all right, so that was two demo I wanted to show you. So let's talk about, like, what problem identity server or Sitecore Identity trying to solve. Internet application or web application change a lot, and the heart of authentication now is actually delegated authorization or authentication. There are different way of authentication services, but OAuth allows you to authenticate or authorize services using the user's authentication, using delegated authentication. It is the actual user who actually give consent to their resources. So that's where OAuth and OpenID Connect comes into picture. So OpenID Connect is actually a thin layer on the top of OAuth. So OAuth came first, and people started using it. But OAuth was really designed for authorization. It was not designed for authentication. Okay, but what happened is it was so appealing. So you can use like Google account or Facebook account to authenticate your application and do single sign-on and things like that. So people really started using as a authentication mechanism than authorization. So, and everyone was creating their own solution and things like that. That's when OpenID Connect, and it actually standardized the authentication part of it. So OpenID Connect is used for only authentication. OAuth, it is based on OAuth, but it sits on the top of OAuth. So application was very simple before. I mean, there was a browser, and then there was web application. People were using web application that way. Now, after that, this happened. Application becomes more and more service-based application with the rise of microservices and things. It's more now application are integrated with multiple services and things like that. So oftentimes it is a different organization. Even if it is in the company, it is actually different department. Maybe those services are developed in different platforms, different languages. Now there is some way to actually protect them. So since there are different platforms and different way of creating services, how to protect them? Okay, so and then this happened. There are mobile application, there are server-based applications. So different way to actually authenticate to it. So this is kind of modern application, and if you think about Sitecore is also going towards service-based application. So how about this? We can actually create a separate service which will be responsible for protecting the resources and authorizing on the behalf of users. For example, a user goes to a web application, and web application tries to use the web service. And web service says, okay, I need something to actually give you the permission to use something that user actually owns. So I need you to give me some sort of thing that I know that user is actually trying to use this service. And then web application goes to that identity provider, which is a different service, and says, okay, can you give me something so that I can provide this to this web service, then I can use it. And identity server or identity provider says, okay, let me talk to the user. And identity server goes talk to the user and say hey, this application wants to use that service. Apparently you own that. And do you want this application, web application, to use that service? Okay. And user said, okay, that's fine. Okay. And identity server then tells the web app, okay, he said good. And here is the token. Okay, you can use this token to tell this web service that that the user is fine. Okay. So that's the really actually what is going on in OAuth. It creates those access token and provides that to the service, and service checks the access token and makes sure that everything is good, and then the web application get to the web service and use the service. So there are a lot of terminology in OAuth. I don't think we can possibly go through all of them, but there are 4 things that are very important. Is that resource. Resource means something that has to be protected. So in this case, if there is a web service that I'm trying to use, web service is a resource. Client who is trying to use the resource. So a web application or even a web service can be a client. Authorization server is responsible for doing the authorization and protecting the resources, and resource owner is really a user. So resource owner owns the resource. Like if I have a Google account and I'm going to give permission to someone to use my Google Drive, so I actually own the Google Drive, and then I give the permission or consent to some application to use my Google Drive. So resource owner is really a user, and who gives the consent, and which is like the delegated authorization, how that works. So how this works in the Sitecore? So Sitecore supports hybrid grant. Hybrid grant means it supports implicit as well as code flow. So implicit grant is more like a front channel authentication, which is little less secured, but I would not say less secured because everything is signed and going through the SSL or TLS. But then there is back channel where a little bit more things happens, and it is secure because it is actually server-side communication. If you want to get something, you have to actually do jump little few more hoops. So here what I'm showing is actually implicit authentication. So when we go to the Sitecore login, Sitecore site sends the client ID, which is Sitecore, and Sitecore is actually a client of Sitecore Identity server, and the client ID is Sitecore, and it sends a redirect URL. It says after you authenticate where you are going to send me back. Response type code ID token. That means that give me everything. It's hybrid grant, so I want code, I want ID token, and token everything. If it is implicit, it will actually provide the ID token is good enough.
I have a small remark on the implicit grant flow. The IETF workgroup on OAuth 2.0 said don't use implicit grant anymore because it's unsafe.
Okay.
So that's good to know from a security perspective.
Right. So yeah, as I said, implicit grant is, but it is needed for the JavaScript-based application, right? So some way you have to actually do that from the browser and authenticate to the server, right? Yep. So once it sends those, and the scope means what I'm trying to access. So what resource I am trying to access. In this case, OpenID is just I'm trying to authenticate. Sitecore profile means I want to know who this user is and things like that. And identity provider send the message back to user and say he wants to use this, Sitecore site wants to use this, and do you consent and can you authenticate? It authenticates and returns to identity provider, and which then send the code, ID token and access token back to Sitecore, which is used to actually authenticate to Sitecore. That's the flow. But if it was like back channel, then there will be a couple of other communication that I didn't mention here. Sorry to show you this, but what I want to show you here is actually what request goes to the identity server. And the bold part is like I was talking about, client ID is Sitecore, response mode is form. That means that return it actually in the form post, response type, and profile, and the redirect URI. That's the request goes to the identity server. And in return, it actually provides the ID token, access token, code in a form. And then Sitecore takes that and use that to log into to Sitecore. Now this token are base 64 encoded. You can really take this token and put it in the JSON Web Token site, and you can basically look at what inside it. And there are three parts. You can have it has the header, payload, and then it's actually signed, so it gets verified every time it is used. And this is where I think that Sitecore is going, but I may be completely out of depth here. So there are four parts here, the resource owner, then the client IC like JSS or browser-based app, Sitecore MVC, SXS storefront. These are the client that will be using identity server for resource authorization. Identity server can actually delegate the authentication to any other identity provider like Okta or Azure or Google Identity, Cloud Identity, and authorize the user. And then resources, I don't know, but what is coming in future, but I envision that the services will be created and services will be protected by Sitecore Identity. Okay, so I have a quick demo. I have not much time left, but I'll try to finish it. Can you please switch it to demo? Okay. So I created if you know Identity Server 4, they have in GitHub they have a lot of samples. Okay, so I fork out from their repo and created Sitecore related some samples, and it's there in the GitHub. So what I did is I created two applications. One is Sitecore MVC client, which is a third-party client, which is authenticated through Sitecore Identity provider and connecting to Sitecore. And by using that, it is using a Sitecore service API. Here I just wrote an example of a sample of using layout service. So it's kind of give you the idea that I can connect from outside Sitecore as a client, and I can use a Sitecore service if I go through the Sitecore Identity provider. So I'll start this. While it is starting, there are two ways a client can be registered to Sitecore Identity provider. You can either go with the configuration, which is always the thing with Sitecore, or you can use dependency injection. So for this client that I created, I actually added a client called external client, whose ID is Sitecore MVC, and then there is there is client secret and what kind of grant type it is using, and what is the course origin, which means that what is the URL for the application that is authenticating to, and then what are different scope this application is trying to use. So that's the way I registered it. And when this application launch is initially not logged in, but I can, if I go and click on secure, it is going to bring up the Sitecore identity provider, and I can authenticate to Sitecore using that. But basically, I'll show you a little bit of code here, and then I will start my Sitecore API. So let's see the Sitecore API, which is just a Sitecore, it's just a RESTful API, and you can see here I am using the layout service. If you have used Java JSS, you know how to use layout services using the API key. So this is actually protected and authorized by the Sitecore by access token, and which is happening here. If you go to, so I have added the authentication here through bearer token, and authority is Sitecore Identity Server, and the audience means that scope that I am trying to use is Sitecore Profile API. So when this API will be used, which is accessing something from Sitecore, it has to be has to have a access token to get to the API. And as far as the client goes, MVC client goes, this is a service here. The client is using the Sitecore authority as the Sitecore identity server, and this is the client ID, and I am using this scope, and then I am using the code and ID token to it's a hybrid grant type. So, and then some regular stuff, MVC applications. So here are some controller methods. Secure is actually authorized. Once that is used, it will show all the user information, and I can log out, I can renew token, and finally I can call the Sitecore API, which I will get the access token and create a client and get to that API. Okay, so if I go to secure, it takes me to Sitecore Identity. I log in, and it brings me back here, and I can see my username and my roles, and then these are the token that I just in the view, I have pasted it here. So I can renew the token, which will use the refresh token to renew it. So my token will change, and then I can call the Sitecore API, because now I have an access token. I can use that to go to that API, and this is the data that is coming from the Sitecore layout service API. And then if I log out, it takes me back to the logout screen. So I think I am, can you please switch it to almost, I have 2 minutes. So that was the demo. This is my blog. There are 3-part blog there, and all the code is in GitHub. I am, oh, okay. Good. So I'm pretty active in the social, like Twitter and things. So if you have any question, you can contact me. Questions? 1 minute.
So since Sitecore 9.1, the old AD module is deprecated or not supported anymore. Have you tried authenticating against an on-premise AD? Or simply just using basic Windows authentication?
No, I have not done that. But I would think, yeah. So I would think that you have to create a provider. So, there is one more question there. I think we can take one more, 30 seconds. So
I was a bit late to the talk, so sorry if you covered this, but I was just wondering how this would work in kind of globally distributed Sitecore solution. So assuming you have multiple regions in terms of data centers, so you might have a web database and a core database based in the States, and your main infrastructure, including your content management server, is in the UK, and say another one in Australia, and we need to use identity server. So obviously that'll be a bottleneck if that's based in just the UK, and you need to authenticate as well as renew tokens from Australia. So have you addressed that kind of scenario when it's in terms of the documentation that you have out there, or have you ever played with this kind of scenario?
no. Yeah, I mean that's a very valid question. Basically, in a distributed scenario, you are thinking about performance and things like that, I guess. So I hope that there is something in Azure, like in a particular situation like that, you will be probably depending on Azure or something, so that you can have a distributed identity provider. So I guess something like that will probably help. But yeah, I have not.
Over the world, like
Okay.
I see a lot of this stuff lacking basically, because a lot of our customers that can afford the licenses are global companies, and we use things like Akamai or multiple distribution nodes in different data centers, and all of the demos are always like a single instance kind of thing. So it'd be nice to see a bit more documentation on this, because if it's an identity server, you're going to be relying on it from all over the world.
I hope someone is here from Sitecore.
There's a lot of people from Sitecore.
Yeah. So, well, yeah, thanks for the question, but I don't think that we should go for any homegrown solution for that. We should, like, use some sort of infrastructure which is already there. So.
You have a question? No. Oh, you're just balancing? All right, okay.
All right. Okay. One more. 2 minutes over.
You showed an MVC application where you went to the login screen, but that was a login screen from Sitecore. What should I change if I want my custom login screen? Because I don't want to present my end customer as the login screen from Sitecore.
What do you want to present? You want to create your own?
Like an extra, if it's an extranet application, then I don't want.
Yeah, so I was talking about that, like, there is an authentication schema name. Okay, you can actually redirect it to, like, to the Azure screen altogether. You don't have to actually use Sitecore login screen. But remember, this is the authentication and other things still in the Sitecore shell or Sitecore admin is still, like, limited to that now. Okay, so application authentication is probably coming next.
You could create a new plugin for that part to change the UI.
Yes, I mean, yeah.
Quick question regarding the part which was commented on during the presentation. So what you use is kind of not quite secure, and can it use really a code flow from OpenID Connect?
Yeah.
So it actually makes also backend channel a call and transferring actually the access token in a more secure way.
Yeah.
Is
definitely.
it supported? Because I tried to use federated authentication, and the libraries from OWIN, they don't really fully implement OpenID Connect protocol, which is compatible with JWT token library that is connected to Sitecore actually. So there are some conflicts there. So
Okay.
yeah. So it's now supported fully out of the box from Identity Server, all features of OpenID Connect protocol.
That is correct. Yes, okay. And it does actually support hybrid authentication. So you can do either like implicit, or you can go with the code flow. Code flow is, as you know, is much secured.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi. Can I jog back your memory to your demos? Your hi. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Your two demos. You had AD and you had the other custom provider. You disabled one and then enabled the other one.
Oh.
And you were saying you had some bug, so I just wanted to know whether you can enable two providers at the same time.
See, this is what I found. Like when the Azure AD provider is there, and I add my own custom provider, my custom provider throws a 500 error. Okay, and we could recreate that. I opened a ticket with Sitecore, and they are still looking at it, and they said that yeah, we can recreate the issue. Okay, that's why I disabled one and enabled the other one.
Can we have two AD providers in there?
Yeah, you can have 2, 3, whatever. And right. Someone told me that actually Azure AD provider is George Chang. Azure AD provider and Facebook, they work together. But it did not work with it's something to do with the runtime plugin, I don't know. Okay, so I'll add that in my blog when I get information from Sitecore. Sorry,
People
we are
ready to clap because they're hungry.
all right, thank you. Shout out for the